Ya estamos listos, profesor Zúñiga.
Muchas gracias, Carlos. Hello, everybody. Welcome to this session in this lecture series in honor to Enrique Dussel, one of the most prominent philosophers in Latin America. And in this session, we are honored to have Professor Amy Allen, who is a professor at the Penn State University, and with her presentation, History, Ethics, and Critique in Dussel's Unknown Marx. And we are really glad to have Professor Allen in this session. And before we start with her presentation, I want to mention a short bio of her. And well, I have to say that Professor Allen is liberal arts research professor of philosophy in women's, gender, and sexuality studies at the Pennsylvania State University, where she's also head of department. Her research takes a critical approach to feminist approaches to power and attempts to broaden traditional feminist understandings of power to apply to transnational issues. She has sat on the executive committee of the Eastern Division of the American Philosophical Association and has been an executive co-director of the Society for Phenomenology and Existential Philosophy, a co-editor-in-chief of Constellations, an international journal of critical theory, and editor of the series New Directions in Critical Theory, published by Columbia University Press. Some of her recent publications are The End of Progress, Decolonizing the Normative Foundations of Critical Theory, published in 2016. Critique on the Couch, Why Critical Theory Needs Psychoanalysis, published in December 2020. And recently, in 2021, Decolonizing Ethics, the Critical Theory of Enrique Dussel, edited with Eduardo Mendieta in their common projects that they have at the Penn State University. So, Professor Allen, we are glad to have you here, and we really appreciate that you accepted our invitation to be part in this lecture series in honor to Enrique Dussel. We really appreciate being with us, dear Professor Amy Allen. I give you the word.
Thank you so much, Professor Zúñiga. It's really a pleasure and an honor to be part of this series with such important and distinguished thinkers who are discussing the work of Enrique Dussel. And it's really, like I said, my honor to be participating. So thank you for including me. Okay, so I'm just going to read what I have written. I think it takes about 45 minutes. In the introduction to Toward an Unknown Marx, published in Spanish in 1988 and in English translation in 2001, Enrique Dussel writes, quote, "Today it is fashionable to consider ourselves in a period of post-Marxism. I think that especially in Latin America, but also in Europe and the United States, rather than being in a period of post-Marxism, we are in a time of serious, measured, profound re-encounter with Marx himself. In the second century of Marxism, if one considers the first to be from 1883 to 1983, we will rediscover in Marx a source of scientific thinking that can be used today, more than in the 19th century, for a critique of globalized capitalism," end quote. Some 20 years after the publication of the English translation of Toward an Unknown Marx, Dussel's words seem remarkably prescient. In the wake of the global financial crisis of 2008 and 2009 and the recession that followed, post-Marxism appears to be over. Indeed, we might say that we have entered a period of post-Marxism, in which American and European critical theorists are increasingly returning to Marx with the aim of clarifying the struggles and wishes of our age. Dussel's Unknown Marx is an invaluable resource for this contemporary critical project. Commentators such as my colleague Eduardo Mendieta have emphasized how important Dussel's reading of Marx was for the development of his own work. While his early work had been critical of Marx as a thinker of dialectical totality, starting in the late 1970s and continuing through the 1980s, based on a deep and extensive engagement with Marx's then newly published notebooks and preliminary drafts of Capital, Dussel revised his reading of Marx. As he himself has explained in the epilogue to the book Decolonizing Ethics that Eduardo Mendieta and I co-edited, this reconsideration was prompted in part by an interest in understanding better the theme of the poor, which is so central to the philosophy of liberation. The profound impact of the previously unknown Marx that Dussel uncovered through this rereading is evident in his monumental Ethics of Liberation. Dussel's material ethical principle is grounded in his reading of Marx's materialism, and his critical ethics, which critiques existing ethical systems from the point of view of the victims, draws on his reading of Marx's critique of capital from the point of view of the exteriority of living labor. As Mendieta has suggested, Dussel's engagement with Marx can be credited with helping him to move from the radical Levinasian sense of alterity that marked his earlier work to the more concrete historical and practical political conception of exteriority evident in the Ethics of Liberation. In this presentation, however, I'd like to focus less on how Dussel's reading of Marx influenced the development of his own work, and more on how Dussel's reading can serve to reorient critical theory's understanding of the prospects for Marxism in the 21st century. In this regard, two aspects of Dussel's Unknown Marx are particularly salient. First, Dussel's is a thoroughly non-Eurocentric Marx, a Marx who has not only begun to envision multilinear historical trajectories, but whose critique of capitalism has broken free of its entanglement with teleological readings of history. Thus, Dussel's is not just a Marx who is deeply aware of the role that colonialism and slavery played in the emergence of European capitalism, but one whose critique of capitalism is articulated from the perspective of the global poor. Second, Dussel's is a deeply humanist Marx, whose ethical critique of capitalist alienation remains central to his work even after his turn to political economy. Rejecting false dichotomies between an early humanist Marx and a late scientific one, Dussel's reading presents a Marx whose capital is ethical to its core. In so doing, Dussel's Unknown Marx provides a compelling, vital alternative to two of the most prominent European Marxisms of the late 20th century, the left Hegelian historicism of Frankfurt School critical theorists such as Jürgen Habermas, and the structuralist Marxism of Louis Althusser, or at least that's what I want to suggest in my remarks today. So first, I'd like to begin by highlighting some of the most important themes from Dussel's reading of Marx. As many of you undoubtedly know, this reading centers on the four drafts of Capital that Marx wrote from the time of the Grundrisse in 1859 forward. It is these relatively unknown texts that open up new possibilities for a rereading of Marx in what Dussel calls his second century from 1983 forward. As I read him, Dussel identifies 7 core themes in these texts. So the first theme has to do with the relationship to Hegel. Contra Althusser's famous claim of Marx's epistemological break from Hegel starting in 1845, Dussel insists on the ongoing influence of Hegel, in particular of Hegel's logic, on Marx's late work. The distinction between appearance and essence is key. Dussel maintains that this distinction is at work in Marx's central argumentative move in Capital's critique of political economy from the realm of circulation to that of production. The move from circulation to production is a move from the surface phenomena or appearances of money and the circulation of commodities to the essence of capital, which is value as it is generated in the production process, or the valorization of value. Dussel insists that the, quote, dialectical, logical, essential discourse of capital begins with the transformation of money into capital, end quote. And thus that the opening discussion in Capital Volume 1 of the commodity form and the money form is merely prefatory to this main line of argument. A related appearance-essence distinction is at work in Marx's distinction between surplus value, which is the essence of capitalist production, and its phenomenal forms of appearance in profit and rent. But in any case, the main link to Hegel's logic is the claim that the central argumentative trajectory of the text moves from appearance to essence. And this leads to the second major theme, the role of science and the understanding of science in Dussel's reading of Marx. So as Dussel reads him, the passage from appearance to essence is what Marx means by science. Referring to the manuscripts of 1863 to 1865, the third draft of Capital, Dussel writes, quote, "These are magnificent texts of great Hegelian precision. Marx is Hegelianized more and more until 1880. In complete control of his phenomenology, of the levels of abstraction, of the systematic dialectic of the categories, that is, of a fully scientific exposition, if by science one understands the passage from the phenomenal, from the visible to consciousness to the essence, to the invisible. From the visible to consciousness, to the essence, to the invisible," end quote. Although Marx sometimes uses the term science in a more everyday sense of the word, referring to scientific and technological means for increasing productivity, for example, Dussel insists that, quote, "This is not the science which Marx himself practices. He practices science in a completely different way," end quote. For Marx, to do science is to engage in, quote, "the critique of appearances, of the pure phenomena that appear on the surface in the world of commodities in circulation, to refer these appearances to the essential world of the real internal movement, in this case, the valorization of the value of capital, and from there to develop the concept of capital through categories," end quote. Okay, the third theme is the inversion of Hegel. So Dussel's unknown Marx follows Hegelian logic and adopts a Hegelian understanding of science, but at the same time, he inverts Hegel's argument. Whereas Hegel begins his logic with being, Marx, following Schelling's critique of Hegel, begins with non-being, specifically with the non-being or nothingness of capital, that is, with living labor. Dussel writes, quote, "The inversion of the rational nucleus of Hegel consists in beginning with non-being, living labor, as the creative source, as in Schelling, from the nothing of being, value and surplus value of capital. Once subsumed, living labor becomes a determination of capital, labor power that is subsumed in the productive process of capital. Now, the Hegelian logic functions perfectly. Marx always remained a Hegelian in the use of the ontological dialectic of totality, but at the same time, he infused that totality, a novelty that always comes to capital from the outside, from the creative transcendentality of living labor. Because though living labor has been subsumed, it remains created from the nothing of capital, from its subjectivity, which can produce value beyond its wage," end quote. In other words, living labor is the non-being of capital, its outside or exteriority. Once living labor is subsumed within the capitalist system, that is, once it is transformed into wage labor, it becomes part of that system's totality. And from this point on, the Hegelian logic, dialectical logic, functions perfectly. But the limitation of Hegel's dialectical logic, for Dussel, is its inability to countenance any beyond to this totality. And it is this beyond that Marx theorizes with his category of living labor. Thus, the exteriority of living labor is, as Dussel puts it, an anti-Hegelian transcendence. So fourth theme, living labor. This brings us to arguably the most important and most generative theme of Dussel's reading of Marx, living labor. The central interpretive move of Dussel's reading is to identify the contradiction between living and objectified labor as the dialectical starting point of the argument of capital. Indeed, Dussel insists that it is this distinction, and not the distinction between concrete and abstract labor or between use value and exchange value, that is fundamental to Marx's critique of political economy. Here is Dussel, quote, "Living labor as the absolute point of departure of the dialectical discourse prior to the existence of capital, as creative source of value from the nothing of capital, is a person, a subjectivity, an immediate corporeality. But at the same time, living labor is absolute poverty, the pauper par excellence. Nonetheless, this creative source is subsumed, incorporated into capital, founded as mediated for the valorization of the value of capital," end quote. As the point of departure for Marx's dialectical argument, living labor is the generative source for all of Marx's critical concepts and categories. Thus, Dussel insists that, quote, "labor is the substance of value, its creative source. Value, commodity, money, etc. are modes of living labor, objectivized, materialized, dead, but living labor anyway, although past. Everything is labor. Capital is nothing but labor, pure and totally objectified living labor," end quote. Importantly, living labor is distinct from the somewhat more familiar terms labor power or labor capacity, the somewhat more familiar Marxist terms labor power or labor capacity, in that the former, as the source of all value, cannot be or have any value. As Dussel explains, quote, "living labor cannot have exchange value because it is the substance or the effective cause of value, while capacity for labor or labor power has exchange value because it can be consumed and can reproduce itself," end quote. Once it has been subsumed within the capitalist totality, living labor becomes wage labor. As subsumed, Dussel writes, it is an internal determination of capital and thus founded in the totality of capital. Concepts such as labor power, wage labor, and the mode of production are thus all, quote, "names of categories and determinations of capital, intratotalized categories founded in capital," end quote. Living labor, by contrast, has not yet been totalized, and as such, it indicates the everlasting presence of the exteriority in capital. And it is this position of exteriority, this radical place beyond the bourgeois perspective, that is the point from which Marx's critique of capital and of capitalism is launched. So this brings us to the fifth theme, which is critique. Dussel insists that critique is not just a theoretical project of the young Marx, that it is also the project of capital. After all, the subtitle of Capital is a critique of political economy, even if many readers pay too little attention to this feature of the text. Indeed, Dussel notes that Marx's late work, quote, "was more critical than constructive. It was more a critique than a positive economic theory that could guide concrete economic actions. It is a fundamental economic critique, a foundation, a critique of the assumptions of economics as such," end quote. Marx's critical project is aimed simultaneously at political economy, that is at bourgeois economic science, and at the actual economy, that is capitalist economy. It is a critique of the science of political economy and of capitalist reality at one and the same time. But crucially, capital is not a work of or a contribution to political economy. It is a fundamental critique of the basic conceptual categories of the discipline of political economy and the core institutions and structures of the capitalist economic system. This critique is issued from a unique standpoint that is at once ante, in, and post festum, Dussel writes. So the standpoint of critique is first and foremost that of the, quote, transcendentality of living labor ante festum, as Marx liked to write, a priori because it is the temporal and logical presupposition of the existence of capital, end quote. The point of view of living labor, or what Dussel calls, following Marx, the pauper ante festum, is exterior to the being of capital. And it's this point of view that enables the critique of capital as a totality. However, because living labor, quote, continues to manifest its beyondness in relation to value, producing surplus value throughout all the stages of capitalist development, its exteriority is at the same time a continuous internal transcendentality, end quote. Thus, the critique of capital and capitalism is also infestum. And finally, living labor reappears as the post-festum standpoint of the useless labor or the unemployed who have been discarded or expelled by capitalism. So sixth theme, exteriority. Exteriority is the condition of possibility for the critique of capitalist or any other, for that matter, totality. As Dussel puts it, quote, exteriority is the practical condition that allows the totality of the capital to be submitted to a critique, end quote. The positivity of living labor alone makes the negation of negation possible. However, this is no merely abstract concept of exteriority or alterity. This is a concrete, practical exteriority that represents the real bodily corporeality of living labor. As Dussel explains, quote, the real reality, Marx says tautologically, of living labor is the place from which it is possible to constitute the totality of capital, not as a realm from which intraworldly entities are understood, but as an entity or object which can be analyzed. The practical articulation of exteriority to the bare corporeality of the laborer is the condition for a critical theory, end quote. The exteriority of living labor is thus not only the creative source of all value within the capitalist system, it is also, Dussel claims, the fulcrum of Marx's criticality. Frederick Mills emphasizes that even in Dussel's earlier, more Levinasian inflected work, the outside of exteriority is always at the same time understood as an interior transcendentality. It is rooted not so much spatially, but rather in the intersubjectivity of those whose lives are negated by the prevailing system. Dussel puts the point this way in his philosophy of liberation, quote, we could also denominate the beyond vis-a-vis the horizon of being of the system an interior transcendentality, a beyond vis-a-vis the subject in the system, vis-a-vis one's work, one's desires, one's possibilities, one's proyecto. Exteriority and interior transcendentality have the same signification in this philosophical discourse. End quote. Thus, even before his embrace of a concrete, practical Marxian notion of exteriority, the beyond of exteriority is, quote, not thought in an absolute total way without any participation in the interiority of the system. As such, exteriority must be understood as transcendentality interior to totality, end quote. And now the seventh and final theme, ethics. As Dussel puts the point succinctly and provocatively, quote, Das Kapital is a book of ethics, end quote. In his initial formulation of this point, Dussel leans on a distinction between morality, understood as conventional codes of conduct, and ethics, which provides the point of view from which existing morality can be assessed and critiqued. Given this distinction, Marx's critique is an ethical critique, quote, if by ethics is understood the transcendental critique of all constituted effective morality, like the bourgeois morality, end quote. Living labor thus provides Marx with a transcendental reference point exterior to the totality of capital that enables his ethical critique of bourgeois capitalist morality. So the relationship between living and objectified labor, between the pauper and capital, is, Dussel claims, the ethical relationship par excellence. The pauper stands in his naked, unadorned corporeality over against capital, which is itself objectified, reified past labor. Capitalism subsumes the exteriority of living labor, transforming it into wage labor and appropriating the surplus value generated through its activity. This subsumption is, quote, injustice, inequality installed in the essence of capital as a social relationship of exploitation, end quote. Finally, adding insult to injury, the prevailing bourgeois morality presents this inequality and injustice as justice, which fulfills with good conscience the demands of capital itself. Thus, unlike those Anglo-American commentators who insist that Marx's late work offers a scientific or a functionalist critique of capitalism, but not a normative one, and unlike those readers who contend that Marx's trenchant critique of bourgeois morality undermines any possible normative aspect to his critique, Dussel rightly insists, I think, on the quite obviously ethical nature of Marx's critical project. Indeed, after summarizing Marx's critique of capitalist exploitation in his Ethics of Liberation, Dussel cites a famous passage from Capital Volume 1, where Marx notes that the accumulation of capital and wealth at one end of the spectrum is simultaneously the accumulation of, quote, misery, the torment of labor, slavery, ignorance, brutalization, and moral degradation at the opposite pole, that is, on the side of the class that produces its own product as capital, end quote. He then notes, Dussel notes, quote, if this is not an ethics, then that word has lost all meaning, end quote. Okay, so having reviewed in a summary way what I take to be the main themes of Dussel's reading of the unknown Marx, I'd like to turn now to the two features of this reading that I find particularly salient for contemporary critical theorists who are once again returning to Marx. My suggestion is that critical theorists would do well to turn to Dussel's Marx in particular, and this for two main reasons. The first of these has to do with the way that Dussel's Marx disarticulates the critique of capitalism from the theory of history with which it is intertwined in Marx's early work, and in some prominent Western Marxist interpretations of Marx as well. And the second point, which I'll come back to in a moment, is Dussel's deeply humanist reading of Marx. So let me stick with the first feature for a moment, the disentanglement of the critique of capitalism from the theory of history. This feature of Dussel's Marx is made possible by his move from dialectics to analectics. For it is Dussel's creative rereading of Marx as an analectical or an anadialectical thinker that allows him to envision a Marx who is not just a multilinear theorist, but one who has entirely broken the connection between the critique of capitalism and the theory of history. I mean, this doesn't mean, I just would say as an aside, that I think Marx completely gives up his earlier theory of history in his late work. You can still actually find some places where he reiterates his kind of earlier stadial view, evolutionary view of history, even in Capital Volume 1. But the point is that Dussel's pulling out a kind of aspect of Marx's work and developing it where the critique of capitalism can be articulated independently of that reading of history. So drawing this idea out not only deepens Dussel's trenchant critique of Habermas, but also shows how his own reading of Marx provides a vital non-Eurocentric alternative to Habermas's reading. So as is well known, Dussel's analectical method is rooted in his reading of Levinas. Thus, the starting point of analectics is the radical transcendence of the other. If dialectics is the ongoing reproduction of the totality, then analectics refers us to the possibility of an exteriority that is not reducible to this totality. For the Dussel of the 1970s, as Eduardo Mendieta explains, quote, Western thought is seen as the succession of dialectically produced and maintained totalities, whose very constitution and preservation has been predicated on the exclusion of an abject alterity, a vilified, despised, exploited, annihilated other, end quote. In his earlier work, Dussel had read Marx as a child and follower of Hegel, and thus, as Mendieta puts it, as a thinker of the totality and an executor of dialectics, end quote. But starting in the 1970s, Dussel rethought his reading of Marx and began to read him as an analectical thinker rather than a dialectical one. Mendieta continues, quote, the reverence and acknowledgement of the life of the other as the living labor of the worker is what makes Marx's method not Hegelian, but Schellingian, and one may add Levinasian, end quote. Moreover, Mendieta argues that this rereading of Marx as an analectical thinker enabled Dussel to, quote, give concreteness to the Levinasian other, which is no longer simply a metaphysical other, but a concrete, material, embodied, historical other, the poor, the wretched of the world, of history, of global capitalism, end quote. And this historical concreteness, one might say, is still more fully developed in Dussel's Ethics of Liberation. So commentators have emphasized how Dussel's analectical or anadialectical reading of Marx enables him to break free of the developmentalist historical trajectories that mark traditional Marxist dialectics. As Linda Martine Alcoff notes, quote, Dussel replaces the Hegelian perspectivism grounded in an imagined developmentalist trajectory of time with a materialist perspectivism grounded in the geography of place, both literal and structural. The world looks different depending on who is doing the looking, end quote. And she continues, quote, the concept of living labor thus allows Dussel to turn our focus toward a form of labor and of praxis that exists outside the Eurocentric frame. In Latin America, indigenous peoples make up an ever-present alternative form of life, not fully assimilated to the wage work model. Marxists should look here, not for the vestiges of primitive accumulation Marx took to be the historical forebear of capital, but as a contemporary sphere of possibilities that can expand our conception of the feasible, end quote. Drawing out this aspect of Dussel's reading of Marx helps to deepen his already quite trenchant critique of Habermas. In his Ethics of Liberation, Dussel notes that Habermas has, quote, a certain difficulty in discovering the sense and universality of what we have called the material aspect of content of ethics, end quote. This lacuna is already evident in Habermas's early reading of Marx, which rests, Dussel claims, on a reduction of Marx's fundamental intuition. Indeed, it's noteworthy that Habermas systematically avoids discussing the role of political economy in Marx, a move that Dussel claims enables him to avoid reflecting on the material aspect of ethics. Indeed, Dussel is critical of Habermas's overly narrow conception of materiality. Habermas's early work equates materiality in Marx solely with work or labor that is focused on physical survival. This is distinguished from interaction, that is social interaction, which will later blossom into Habermas's concept of communicative action. In the early Habermas, the ethical, or it might be better to say the normative moment, is associated with interaction, and labor or work are solely associated with material survival through technical means. Thus, the labor interaction distinction in the early Habermas is a forerunner to his later distinction between system and life world. But having defined materiality so narrowly, and in opposition to the social or ethical or communicative dimension of social life, Habermas then criticizes Marx for lacking an account of interaction, and thus of the normativity of the life world, and thus of ethics. So Habermas's criticism of Marx, one of the main ones, is that he doesn't have a foundation for a normative critique of society. As Dussel puts the point, Habermas criticizes Marx for falling into productivism and for limiting his conception of rationality to instrumental reason. But what Habermas fails to see, according to Dussel, is, quote, that Marx is placing himself at a more fundamental level. What is of interest to Marx is a material universal criterion of the life of the human subject, beyond every culture or economic system. Work, relations of production, capital as a system, and the economy itself are moments of a process of the reproduction and development of human life that materially roots, because of its content, all of human ethical life, end quote. In other words, Habermas fails to grasp Marx's fundamental intuition regarding the material aspect of a universal ethics, an intuition that Dussel puts at the center of his own ethical system. So according to Dussel, this lacuna in Habermas's argument diminishes the critical force of his project, and it sets him off on his excessively formal conception of ethics as it's developed in the discourse ethics. Although the Ethics of Liberation incorporates a formal moment as well, unlike discourse ethics, it is also an ethics of content because of its material moment. I would say, however, that the problem cuts a bit deeper than this for Habermas. For his discourse ethics isn't, in my view, quite as formal as some interpretations make it out to be. As I've argued in more detail elsewhere, there's actually quite a bit of content built into Habermas's discourse ethics, content that is supplied by his theory of modernity. For Habermas, the formal principles that make up his discourse ethics and that are undergirded by his universal, formal, pragmatic conception of language are themselves achievable only in post-traditional modern societies that make possible the requisite post-conventional forms of autonomy and ego identity. Thus, Habermas's theory of modernity plays a crucial, if often unacknowledged, role in grounding his discourse ethics, or at least that's my contention in chapter 2 of The End of Progress. Now, the roots of Habermas's account of modernity go back to his early project of reconstructing Marx's historical materialism. This project formed the backbone of the theory of social evolution, which later became Habermas's theory of modernity. In it, Habermas doubles down on the developmentalist trajectory so prominent in Marx's early work. From the 1950s through the 1970s, Habermas's work was devoted largely to the task of reconstructing Marx's theory of historical materialism. As Habermas would say, taking it apart and putting it back together so that it can more fully attain its own goals. Habermas finds in Marx's theory of historical materialism the basis for what he called an empirical philosophy of history with practical intent. Indeed, Habermas indicates that he turns to Marx rather than Hegel for this task because Marx offers a thoroughly immanent conception of history, according to which, quote, critique must comprehend itself as a moment within the situation which it is seeking to supersede, end quote. This is an important insight for Habermas, given his reflexive aim of specifying the historical conditions under which reflection upon history became possible for us and came to be thought of as central to the project of critical philosophy. In other words, Habermas, through Marx, strives to situate his historically self-conscious critical philosophy within its own historical situation. Habermas's reconstruction of historical materialism, which forms the backbone of his theory of social evolution, seeks to preserve this insight while at the same time redressing the objectivism, productivism, and lack of normative foundations that Habermas takes to be problematic in Marx's work. I mean, so in a way, what I'm suggesting is that Habermas is like the antithesis to Dussel's reading of Marx, because he's first of all saying that Marx's account of normativity is insufficiently elaborated, but to the extent that there's an account of normativity that one could build on there, it's precisely in and through the dialectical developmentalist historical trajectory of historical materialism, whereas Dussel locates the locus of normativity outside of that developmental reading of history. So Dussel comes close to this reading of Habermas in his book, L'Ultimo Marx, where he is critical of Habermas's toward a reconstruction of historical materialism on the grounds that Habermas reads Marx more from the perspective of his own agenda, that is the theory of social evolution, than from the perspective of what Marx was trying to accomplish. Thus, Habermas fails to realize that the notion of historical materialism is far from the central problematic nucleus of Marx's thought. In general, Dussel charges Habermas with overemphasizing the importance of historical materialism in Marx and oversimplifying Marx's view of history in a unilinear way, all in the interest of shoehorning historical materialism into his theory of communication. In general, Dussel charges Habermas with theorizing capitalism from the point of view of so-called late capitalism in Europe, rather than from the point of view of the periphery. After all, it's only from this perspective that Habermas could possibly think that our goal should be the completion of modernity, or even that modernity could be brought to a happy end. Western Marxists, Dussel concludes, are left Hegelians who reject Schelling as a reactionary. Thus, they stake their conception of critique on a thoroughly immanent historical interpretation of utopia, whereby socialism is the necessary overcoming of capitalism or the necessary realization of certain objective historical tendencies that are present within capitalism, as Marx himself admittedly up until the late 1860s. By contrast, Dussel claims Marxists from the periphery tend to reject Hegel and to unknowingly align themselves to the left of Schelling by rooting their Marxism in the hunger and misery of the people, giving priority to the economic, thus to bodily needs, as opposed to communication or argumentation, as Habermas does. The reality of the Latin American periphery, Dussel argues, demands a different reception of Marx. So my point in recounting Dussel's critique of Habermas and trying to extend it a little bit further is not to beat up on Habermas yet again. Rather, it's just to underline the point that it is only because Habermas stakes his account of social evolution, which I'm contending undergirds his entire normative project, on his reading of historical materialism, that Habermas can describe himself as late as 1989 and in all seriousness as, quote, the last Marxist. But with Marxist friends like that, we might say with Dussel, who needs enemies? Dussel, by contrast, offers us an entirely different Marx, one whose work is infused from start to finish with an ethical and normative perspective, a perspective, moreover, that is not in any way rooted in a developmental theory of history or an account of objective historical trends. Dussel thus uncovers in his Unknown Marx a different strategy for grounding our normative critique of contemporary capitalist reality. Rather than insisting on grounding critique imminently in the objective historical tendencies, a strategy that leads Habermas to search for progressive historical trajectories in the present that can be completed or brought to a culmination, Dussel identifies a source of imminent transcendence in the concrete, practical, embodied exteriority of living labor. Okay, so now I turn to my last section on alienation and ethics, which is much shorter than the first two. So if the first feature of Dussel's Unknown Marx drives a wedge between his work and the reception of Marx within Frankfurt School critical theory, the second feature arguably draws him closer to that tradition. As I've already mentioned, Dussel's is a deeply humanist Marx, whose ethical critique of capitalist alienation is an abiding concern throughout his life. Recall that Dussel's reinterpretation of Marx centers on the Grundrisse and Marx's notebooks of the 1860s, leading up to the publication of Capital, Volume 1 in 1867. Dussel repeatedly compares the potential impact of the belated publication of these late manuscripts to the impact of the publication of Marx's economic and philosophical manuscripts of 1844 on early 20th century Marxism. And as I'm sure you all know, the publication of the economic and philosophical manuscripts of 1844 were hugely important for the Frankfurt School's reception of Marx. They've basically always read Marx as a humanist, I would say. So here is Dussel, quote, when in 1925, the economic and philosophical manuscripts of 1844 were published, on which Marcuse so astutely commentated, a rediscovery of Marx was begun. The Grundrisse, published in 1939 and 1954, did not have the same effect, end quote. Still, Dussel insists that these later manuscripts and notebooks have the potential for similarly profound reorientation of our understanding of Marx, even if they have not yet received the attention they deserve. Dussel describes this Marx, the Marx of his second century, from 1983 forward, as, quote, the philosopher and economist who critically deconstructs capitalist economics and reconstructs it anthropologically and ethically in a democratic vision in which the responsible and participating individual is fully realized in the community and in solidarity, end quote. But Dussel not only connects Marx's later manuscripts to the 1844 manuscripts formally, in terms of their potential to profoundly reorient our understanding of him, but also in terms of their content. Both sets of texts show Marx in close internal dialogue with Hegel, and both reveal alienation to be his fundamental ethical concern. Commenting on a passage from the later manuscripts, Dussel writes, quote, Marx here expresses with greater precision and an explicit philosophical and ontological standing the youthful themes of the manuscripts of 1844. But then they were only intuitions. Now they are the development of concept by scientific dialectical categories. It is one of the best ontological texts of Marx, end quote. Dussel's is a humanist, but a non-essentialist Marx, I would say. On his reading, starting with the economic and philosophical manuscripts and continuing through Capital, quote, the human being made of flesh and blood, muscles and desires, needs was the point of departure. Living labor as the radical opposite to objectified labor. Living labor is the simplest, most concrete, and yet in its exteriority regarding capital, the obligatory reference of all subsequent development, end quote. So note that the reference point here for the critique of alienation is not the somewhat murky quasi-metaphysical notion of species being familiar from Marx's early work, but rather the bodily, needy corporeality of living labor. On Dussel's reading, alienation becomes the central thread that runs throughout Marx's lifelong critique of capitalism. It is the ethical reference point even of his most mature critique of capitalism in Capital Volume 1. For Dussel, the subsumption of the exteriority of living labor into the capitalist totality and its resulting transformation into wage labor is at the same time alienation. As Dussel explains, quote, the ethical perversity of capital is consummated at this moment, even before the effectivity of the purchase, the alienation. An other man/woman, free, conscious, autonomous, is transformed into a thing, an instrument, a mediation of capital, end quote. That is the ethical perversity of capital, is the transformation of living labor into a thing or an instrument or a mediation of capital, which is to say, alienation. The productive force of labor within the capitalist system is the, quote, alienated actuality in the totality of capital of the exteriority of living labor, end quote. That is, it is what living labor becomes after it has been alienated, reified, turned into mere instrumentality. Only now, Dussel continues, can the oracle of the manuscript of 1844 be understood. The man of labor, now living labor, daily transforms his whole nothingness, living labor as not capital or nothingness, into absolute nothingness, into wage labor, not a dignified human being, but an instrumental thing, end quote. As I mentioned earlier, Dussel emphasizes the fact that Marx's critique is two-pronged. It is simultaneously a critique of capitalist social relations and of the discipline of political economy. Keeping this dual structure of Marx's critique in mind, we can see that alienation is the counterpoint to fetishization. Dussel underscores the scope of Marx's critique of fetishism. He is concerned not just with commodity fetishism, but with the fetishism of value. That is, with the way that political economy sees value as an absolute property of things, rather than as a product of historically specific social relations. By contrast, Dussel insists that for Marx, quote, value is relative in all its aspects. First, because living labor is its creative source. Second, because exchange is its destination. Third, and because its own character is objectified social labor, materialized. Value can never be absolved from relativity. Its essence is as a social relationship. To absolutize is the first moment of capital fetishization as such, in its most fundamental nature. So the movement of capital and of political economy is to fetishize historically specific social relations of capitalism into absolutes. And thus the antidote to fetishism for Marx is science, in the sense that I discussed it earlier. The aim of science is to defetishize political economy's claim to universality. It is to criticize political economy's intention to confuse itself with the nature of things. It does this by revealing the domination of objectified labor over living labor as the core of capitalism. Dussel writes, quote, all the development of Marx's discourse as science starts from the fundamental contradiction of past labor that dominates over living labor. The thingly existence of the past labor denies the living labor from where the essence of capital emerges. It is the mystification, the upside down world where the objective fetishistically alienates the subjective. So there we have, end quote. So there we have kind of fetishism and alienation sort of working side by side in the same passage. Fetishization is the mystification of inherently social and historically specific capitalist relations, which are presented in this upside down world as if they were absolute. But the relationship that they're mystifying is precisely this transformation of living labor into objectified labor, that is into capital, which is itself alienation. So for all of Dussel's criticisms of Lukács, by placing alienation and reification at the center of his reading of Marx, he actually comes quite close to the early Frankfurt School's interpretation, which likewise has always emphasized Marx's humanism. Dussel's great innovation with respect to this line of interpretation, however, is to divorce the notion of alienation or reification from an all-encompassing conception of social totality. For it was this move, effectively the denial of any exteriority to capitalism, that left Lukács no other option for grounding critique than the point of view of the revolutionary proletariat as the subject-object of history. By identifying a different locus for the critique of capitalism, an alternative to rooting critique in an unfolding historical dialectic, Dussel offers us a promising strategy for disentangling the critique of capitalism from the philosophy of history, as I've already suggested. Moreover, his reading, unlike Althusser's influential anti-historicist reading, has the advantage of not compelling us to choose between a youthful humanist Marx and a mature scientific one. Dussel's Marx is a scientific humanist in a precise Hegelian sense. For Dussel's Marx, the scientific project of defetishization goes hand in hand with the ethical critique of alienation. The exteriority of living labor gives us a vantage point on the totality of the system that reveals it as a system, thus detotalizing it. At the same time, from this vantage point, the totality of the capitalist system has sense, and an unjust or perverse ethical sense at that. So Marx's scientific judgment about capital is at the same time an ethical, practical judgment that is in solidarity with the interests of the proletariat. Capital's essence is the appropriation of surplus value from unpaid labor. The concrete purpose of the entirety of Marx's scientific elaboration is the revelation of the, quote, hidden, mystified, fetishized injustice that is the essence of capital, end quote. Thus, Marx's materialism is historical, but also ethical. Quote, it is the materiality of the laborer's corporeality, his body, his basic needs, his sensibility, from which all that is economic emerges, from which all economic science must be thought. From such a real and sensible corporeality of living labor, everything must be ethically judged, end quote. Okay, so a couple of very brief comments in conclusion, as I'm really very interested in the conversation and in hearing your feedback and questions. I mean, my main suggestion is that Dussel's Unknown Marx is an antidote to left Hegelian readings of Marx with their residual commitments to Eurocentric progressivism, a la Habermas. And at the same time, it's an antidote to structuralist anti-humanist readings of Marx, a la Althusser. And it's interestingly the exteriority of living labor, I think that's the conceptual key to both of those moves. But I want to suggest in closing that this is the Marx that critical theorists need as we approach the midpoint of Marx's second century, a Marx whose philosophical method provides important resources for the critique of contemporary globalized capitalism. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much to you, dear Professor Amy. And well, thank you for this great presentation on Dussel's Marx from this reading to the Grundrisse. And no, this is the manuscript 61, 63. And well, thank you so much. So we open a time for feedback. So if someone wants to present a comment or a question to Professor Amy Allen, please just raise your hand and we give the word. So I check if we have questions here in YouTube, and or okay, yeah. So the guest here in the Zoom session, if someone wants to present some a question or a comment to Professor Allen, please. Yeah, Carlos Segura writes a question, Professor Allen. Do you want to read it, or do I?
I'm reading it now. So let me see. The one that's in the chat, you mean?
Yeah.
Yeah. Considering, well, should I just read it aloud? Because the people on the YouTube can't see this, right? Yeah.
Yeah.
So the question says, considering the fact that Habermas's interpretation of Marx is the antithesis of Dussel's interpretation, and Dussel has criticized Habermas's interpretation, are there similarities between Dussel's and Axel Honneth's interpretations of Marx? I'm asking this because Honneth has worked with the concept of alienation, and also because, as far as I'm concerned, he tries to escape from Habermas's interpretation of Marx. So that's a really interesting question, and I haven't gone back and reviewed Axel's interpretation of Marx. And now, as thinking on my feet, I'm trying to think of like where that's, sort of most concentrated. I mean, because his work on reification obviously deals a lot with Lukács, but also with Heidegger, and not so much with Marx, as I recall. And his more recent work on socialism is actually, I think, not so grounded in Marx. So I'm not sure how to answer the question. I have to think more about it. I mean, I do think, I think that on the point with respect to alienation, that you might be right, that, that perhaps Honneth is closer to Dussel there. At the same time, I think, I don't see any analog in Honneth's work to something like the exteriority of living labor as a point of view that allows you to sort of think outside of, think normativity outside of a developmentalist trajectory. I mean, I feel like on that point, whether it's coming from a reading of Marx, or in Honneth's case, it's probably more from his reading of Hegel, Honneth is very close to Habermas, it seems to me. So, so that's just to say, I think there would still be a strong contrast between Dussel and Honneth, maybe not so much on how they're reading Marx, but more on how they're thinking about what is the locus for the normativity of critique. Because Honneth, I think, very much in line with Habermas, is locating that within a particular kind of historically unfolding, developmental trajectory. But maybe you have in mind, if you have in mind a particular text of Honneth's, that might be helpful, because I'm having a hard time right now, off the top of my head, thinking of which are the texts where Honneth discusses Marx in detail.
Carlos, do you want to mention a particular text of Honneth? Okay, maybe not.
Yeah,
we can,
that's okay.
To the next comment or question, please. Don't be shy. Bruno, please.
Okay, thank you. I'm sorry, my English is not that good, but I will try my best. So as far as I understood, the idea of life in labor, or I don't really know how to translate it, but because I think on Spanish as trabajo vivo. No.
Living labor is how it's
living
translated.
labor, yeah. It's an exteriority, since as far as I knew. But what happens with, well, Marx on the prologue of 69, he said that well, he just talked about his work was about to examine the system of bourgeois economy in the following order: capital, landed property, wage labor, the state, foreign trade, and the world market. And these are specified as, at some point on the work of capital, these other categories are exteriorities to the capital. They are things itself within each one of the, for example, the accreditation system, or the rent, and all these kind of other elements in the capital. They have a sense within itself, and I don't know if this idea of the working of the live labor or living labor, or I'm sorry, but well, the wage labor is a category that it wasn't touched, it wasn't examined with itself and the critique of economy politics of Marx. So how can we say that we understand wage labor and more than that, the working, the living labor, if we don't understand, maybe, or if we are not seeing the totality of the critique of economy politics of Marx. It doesn't suppose misreading, or I don't say misreading, but taking apart the work of Marx to talk about categories that isn't clarified by Marx. I mean, because I can say whatever I want to landed property, and I can say that's the analytic position, because the landed property, it's far beyond the capital, far beyond, and far beyond the value form. No, so I don't know. I have this question. I'm sorry if I can't give it to you as I would do in Spanish, but my question is what happens with all this disorder, with all this method, with all this plan to examine the totality, and that was the totality. I think the totality is not only capital in general. It's well, that's not the totality. The totality is that six maybe categories in the system. No, don't you? And I was that my question. What do you think about this category of wage labor, which will be the third category after the capital and landed property to examine by Marx, and the relation with the living labor? Yeah, that was.
Yeah.
I'm sorry.
No, please don't apologize. I mean, I'm the one who should apologize for my inability to speak Spanish, which is forcing you to have to put your question into English. So my apologies for that. But I think I understand the gist of the question, which is a very, very complicated one. And it seems to me, I mean, it's more of a question, I would say, for Professor Dussel. I mean, because I hear you to be sort of pushing back on the claim that living labor is the exteriority to capital, right, to the capitalist system or something. And I, in my presentation, have sort of granted Dussel that claim. I mean, I'm not interrogating that critically. I think, I mean, he's quite explicit in everything that I've read that he writes about these, about Marx, that the project was radically incomplete. I mean, as you're pointing out, right? Like there were all these planned further volumes. And so we have access only to actually a really small percentage of what it was that Marx planned to do. I suspect that Dussel would say, and this seems like intuitively plausible to me too, that these later volumes all would have were intended to spell out further features of the capitalist system. But I hear you saying that, Marx describes them as exteriorities. So like maybe there are multiple exteriorities to capital. And so what about that? I mean, I don't know even if that's true, I don't know that it really causes a problem for Dussel's argument. I mean, what's important, I think, is, at least what I think is really important, is that one doesn't have to find a foothold for normative critique kind of within this ongoing developing historical trajectory. That's the really key move. So if there are multiple exteriorities, I don't see that causes a problem, like a fatal problem for the argument. I mean, I actually was thinking about this a lot because as far as I can see, Dussel doesn't actually focus a lot on Marx's account of primitive accumulation. And that's another, one might say, moment of exteriority to capitalism. I mean, the moment when Marx talks about primitive accumulation is about what's the historical process by means of which the worker confronts the capitalist in the free labor market as free in the dual sense, able to make a contract and also unencumbered by the means of production. Well, that's the story of primitive accumulation. And of course, that's a very complicated concept and highly contested in Marx and bound up with questions about his theory of history and so forth. But I find it interesting because it seems to me in Capital Volume 1 that, Dussel really focuses on this first turning point in the argument, which is where we move from the surface appearance of capitalist, of circulation of commodities in the market into what Marx calls the hidden abode of production. And as I read Capital Volume 1, that is like that first turning point is super important, but then it's sort of mirrored by this other turning point at the end of the text, which is like, well, how does it come to be the case that the worker, is kind of thrown into the labor market with no ability to acquire the means of subsistence other than selling his labor power to the capitalist? And that's, the second turning point where we go to the story of primitive accumulation. And anyways, this is just to say, I think that's another moment where you could say there's a kind of exteriority to capital that is maybe more of, rooted in a historical story than in this kind of geographical exteriority. But I don't see any of that. I mean, I actually thought about talking about that in this talk, and maybe I would say more about it in the kind of final written version. But I don't think it's really a challenge to Dussel's argument. Actually, I just think it's another kind of element that would make the story slightly more complicated. But it's sort of in a way helps to make his point, which is that. Which I think is compelling, right? That what Marx is doing is a kind of an imminent critique of political economy, but it's one that where there's a search he's constantly sort of working within the discourse of political economy in Capital Volume 1, but searching for a foothold to critique it, right? And that is this point of view of exteriority that is either provided by the category of living labor, or you might say by the point of view of primitive accumulation, or maybe there are other points of view too, but there has to be something that makes, that's the viewpoint from which the critique is possible. Did I get it? Some of what you were asking anyway?
Yeah, that was pretty interesting. Thank you. And yeah, that all these things will or should be should complicating the arguments of this thing, and I think it's necessary to do that. But thank you a lot.
Thank you, Bruno, for your question. And Carlos continues with his question, dear Amy.
Mm-hmm.
And he writes here the text he refers pathologies of social.
Mm-hmm.
Pathologies of social. It's a brief article, but the honest I guess I have the text in German. Maybe there is some
I really appreciate the reference, Carlos, and I have to go back. Yeah. Thank you.
The Vernunft.
In fact, that volume appeared in English in the series that I edit with Columbia, so I have definitely read it. I just have to go back and think more about this. I appreciate the suggestion, and I think, like I said, it seems right to me that Honet's interpretation of Marx does focus more on the critique of alienation and sort of Marx as a social philosopher, Marx as someone who's engaging in an ethical project. And in that sense, I think it would be quite complementary to Dussel's reading in a way that would be useful to explore. I think the difference, I would say, is that the way that Honet grounds his own critical project, I think, is much more in line with this kind of developmentalist, historicist sort of view that Dussel's offering an alternative to. So I don't see the analog for that in Honet's reading, but I do see the focus on alienation and the ethical, and that's helpful. So I'll go back and read that essay again. Thank you for the suggestion.
Well, if someone here in the Zoom session wants to raise the hand to ask something to Professor Amy Allen, please. Eduardo? Diego. Okay, Diego. Please, Diego.
Hi, Professor Amy Allen. Thank you for your presentation. First, I apologize. My English is not the best, but I have one question. I think in all of these points of view, we can find a point of exception, which these authors found his critique. Even one of these points can be found in Habermas' critique to Lukács, Adorno, and Horkheimer. He says that the Lebenswelt can be reduced to the systemic totality. This perspective moves in a discursive lever, but in other authors of the critical theory, like Horkheimer, we can find other concept to enunciate this point of exception, the suffering. In Dussel's philosophy, this concept appears. My question is there any relationship to the concept of living labor and the concept of suffering in this way? Thinking about concepts like an enunciation of point of exception of the totality?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, that goes back to the question about Hannut too, because of course Hannut would say that critique starts in the negativity of an experience of suffering. So, and that's a sort of a Dornian moment, I guess, in Hannut's work that maybe, I mean, maybe it's an analog to something like the position of the exteriority of living labor. So I think that's a really interesting suggestion. I mean, I was actually thinking about this a little bit in relationship to Adorno, because I was, looking back at some of Dussel's critique of Adorno and of negative dialectics in his, it might be in Ethics of Liberation, but maybe it's in the Unknown Marx book. But his claim is that negative dialectics, it doesn't really offer a point of view outside of the totality. And I'm not sure that that's fair, actually. If you think about, for example, the role of the suffering body in Adorno's work, that seems actually like a moment that is outside of the totality. And that could be then interestingly connected to, Dussel's notion of exteriority. So I had a similar, I guess, kind of like hazy intuition in working on this talk, but I have to think more about how to develop it further. So thank you very much for that question.
Thank you, Diego, for your question, and thank you, Professor Allen, for the answer. Eduardo, do you want to make a comment, to present a question?
Yeah, a comment. Amy, that was brilliant. I love that essay. I hadn't seen how to read that Schellingian Levinasian moment in Dussel's reading of Marx as a critique of the philosophy of history. And you convinced me. That's really awesome. But then I have to ask you, and I think we talked about this really briefly, how do you see that implicit critique of the philosophy of history working with Dussel's own conception of moral development? That I think we talked about that, but now I think you complicated your own understanding of that. And I don't know if you can comment on that, but I just think that that's a brilliant paper. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Eduardo. I feel like I think I got a lot of the impetus for it from reading your work. So I give you the credit. But I mean, I haven't thought yet how to connect this. I mean, I think, as we talked about before, Dussel's conception of progress and development is really complicated because there is this notion of moral development that he's working with. At the same time, he's just, extremely critical of Eurocentric teleologies of history. So there is this complicated back and forth. Anyway, what I called in the other paper that I wrote, the ethics and the politics of progress. And so I guess I see what's happening here is a critique of the sort of ideological notion of progress and an attempt to develop a different foundation for thinking ethics that could then it then enables judgments of progress, right? It's the question of like, what's the grounding for those judgments? And I think the locating of the fulcrum of critique in the exteriority of living labor is a way to try to avoid this historicist grounding.
Yeah.
I mean, it's not without its own problems, right? Because I'm always like a fan of the idea that, critique must be imminent and we're always, rooted in history and time and place and so on. But I think the difficulty is the way that seems to make the grounding of critique in a sort of historical unfolding seem like a compelling option, if you know what I mean. Because you start with the idea that like the point of view of critique has to be imminent to this historical, moment or something like that. I don't know. That's all just to say I don't know the answer, but I think that even sort of that this doesn't completely undermine any and all talk of progress or of development. It's a question of like, what's the foundation for that type of ethics?
And then there might be another person here that would be Adorno. And Adorno's negative dialectics, where he does develop a kind of negative moral norm, which is that Auschwitz shall not happen again. And in a sense, Dussel actually in the Ethics of Liberation draws on Adorno and Horkheimer and Benjamin's critique, as opposed to Adorno and Honath. I mean Habermas and Honath. But that's a really interesting conception. I think that's really generative, the way you linked up his Marx and Lebendige Arbeit as a critique of the what in Spanish is called desarrollismo, this teleological philosophy of history. But that's really, really interesting. And so,
I think Adorno, I mean, I would love to do some more with the connection to Adorno, because when Adorno talks about like his own sort of positive understanding of progress, like after he's sort of demolished the idea that there has been progress up to now, which Auschwitz, makes kind of offensive to even think. He says, well, progress would be something like, there's different formulations, right? It's the avoidance of catastrophe. It's that Auschwitz should never happen again. But it's also like the establishment of the human. So there is this sort of humanist moment there too, which seems to me really important in the way that Dussel's reading Marx. And of course, then I think in his own development of the ethics of liberation. So I think there was a lot more that could be said about Adorno here that I just didn't have time to get to yet.
Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Eduardo, and thank you, Amy. Someone wants to present a comment or a question to Professor Allen? No. Professor Allen, do you want to add something that is missing in your presentation, or something that I think the guys here in the Zoom session are really shy, and except to Eduardo and Diego. And well, if you want to add something to the presentation or to your the answers you gave.
Well, I don't know. I mean, this is all what I presented is very new. Is very work in progress. So I'm grateful to all of the questions, and there's lots more that I need to kind of think through. I mean, one thing I didn't talk about at all, which of course is really important for Dussel's reading of Marx, but it's mainly because I don't know what to do with it. So I'll just put it out there, and maybe some people have thoughts about it. But it's the fact that one thing that's really distinctive about his reading is that he is not at all apologetic for Marx's use of the labor theory of value. So if you read like a lot of, either analytic Marxists in the US and England, will say, oh, well, of course, the labor theory of value is deeply problematic. And, but like we just have to try to detail what's relevant about Marx, like setting that whole thing aside. So they're sort of embarrassed by it almost. And others like people like Moïse Postone, David Harvey, different commentators on Marx will say, oh, Marx didn't actually accept the labor theory of value, right? He was doing this kind of internal critique of political economy, and they accepted it. And so he accepts it for the purposes of his critique, but he doesn't really believe in it, you know? So, and Dussel doesn't do any of that. I mean, he just sort of says, yeah, like this whole centerpiece of Marx's critique of political economy rests on this idea that labor is the source of all value, and that value is distinct from profit and rent, and that because that, you know, without that idea, you don't have the notion of surplus value, and therefore you don't have exploitation. So, you know, and then he sort of, that's really important for his reading of dependency theory, that, you know, without a notion of surplus value and the appropriation of surplus value, like differentially across, you know, in international context, like you wouldn't have a theory of dependency too. So anyways, I didn't talk about any of that. I don't know if people want to talk about that. I didn't talk about it partly because I'm interested more in, I guess, thinking about Marx from the point of view of the project of critique. That's maybe for my own purposes. So that's the kind of strand of Dussel's reading that I wanted to pull out, but also because I just don't know what to do with the labor theory of value. I'm going to be really honest. Like, I just don't know. I don't know. Like, I've been reading a lot about it, and I just don't know. I don't know where to stand with it. So there's a big, huge topic that I didn't talk about, that if somebody wants to talk about, we could discuss.
Yeah, and you is, if I understand well, you see that Dussel stresses this living labor as something really important to ground the ethics, no? And that's not clear in other authors, that is something. Yeah, living labor is a category of Marx, but maybe it's not. The accent is not in this category in other authors. Than in Dussel is, no?
Yeah, no, that's right. And I think actually I was going to say this earlier in response to one of the questions, but I got sidetracked. But I mean, so Dussel criticizes Habermas for reading Marx like from the point of view of his own interest, which is the theory of social evolution. And I think that's fair. But I think one could also say about Dussel that he's reading Marx from the point of view of his own interest, which is in developing a kind of critical theory of liberation from the point of view of the global periphery or something. So, I mean, I don't see that as a major criticism, because I think that's what great philosophers do. They read other philosophers, you know, from the point of view of their own systematic interests. And so I think that's what I would say for someone who said, well, you know, I don't see why living labor is such a huge, you know, it doesn't seem like it's actually such a huge issue in Marx himself, you know, and I think that might be right. It's important for Dussel's Marx, you know, which I think is maybe not the same as Marx himself always, but that's okay because, you know, I mean, so this is why I mentioned it kind of briefly during the paper too, that I actually would say if I wanted to be critical of Dussel's reading of Marx, just like Quay reading of Marx, I would say I don't think he acknowledges enough the way that Marx actually seems to remain committed to his theory of history, even as late as Capital Volume 1, because there's a recapitulation of it at the, you know, in this section in Part 8 on primitive accumulation, where he sort of like restates the theory. And, you know, says like the fetters of, you know, on capitalist accumulation must be burst asunder, and they will be burst asunder. And like, there's all this kind of language that comes almost directly from the preface to the Contribution to the Critique of Political Economy, which is a text that Dussel kind of says, so it isn't actually that important, you know. So, I mean, this is all kind of pedantic, like interpretive stuff, but like as an interpretation, I would say, I'm not sure he takes those moments, like, he pushes them to the side more than I would in a straightforward just reading of Marx, but in a way that I think is incredibly productive, actually, because it helps you to see how you could articulate the critique of capitalism without this baggage, actually, which I think Marx himself struggled to figure out how to do that, and never, wasn't sort of, never fully left that theory of history behind in my reading of him. Does that make sense? So anyways, I see, that's one reason I tried to talk about like Dussel's Marx, which is, I think, its own thing, and has as much to do with his own creative systematic interests and interpretation, and strong reading, let's say, as it does with what Marx himself said.
Yeah, and maybe that reading that you have from Dussel is due to the fact that Dussel wanted to present another reading to Marx that has a distance with the classical Marxism, with the standard Marxism that we know from Western, no?
Yeah.
I think that that is and something like a effort and approach that Dussel wanted to present in these three works on Marx, no?
Yeah.
So I don't know how you see this point.
Yeah, no, I agree. I mean, I would say, even if, there's one question is like, what's the most faithful interpretation of Marx? And then there's another question is, what's the most productive way of taking up Marx's project now? And I guess what I was trying to say is, I think the separating of the critique of capitalism from the philosophy of history is absolutely essential for developing a non-Eurocentric Marxism. So I see that move in Dussel, whether it's faithful to Marx fully or not, or it's more creative interpretation, as hugely productive. So I think
we have another
Valeria
question.
has a question.
Yeah, Valeria has a question. Valeria, please.
Hi. Yes. Hi. Thank you for taking my question. I think it just clarified with what you just said. My question was, how would Dussel's reading of Marx would overcome Althusser and the critical theories reading? That was not quite clear to me.
Mm-hmm.
I understood the thesis, but I didn't understand why. Why would it overcome the other readings? Would it have something to do, like, I don't know, I read Dussel's, it was a paper or something he wrote, like a couple essays he wrote back then about the theological reading of Marx, or the theological writing of Marx. I can't recall its name, but would it have something to do with how Dussel at first was very interested in theology, and how Marx was also studying theology, so its ethics were like some of the main points in both writers.
Mm-hmm. I mean, I think that's really fascinating. Actually, Eduardo could probably talk about it, because there's some papers I know in the that collection Beyond Philosophy that kind of deal with the relationship between the Marxism and the theology. It's not an aspect of Dussel's work that I'm expert on. I mean, I would just say, in response to the first part of your question, I mean, what I was trying to suggest is that the way that Dussel's reading of Marx, let's say, overcomes or is a viable, preferable alternative to the Habermasian reading is precisely because he locates the standpoint of critique not within this unfolding progressive historical trajectory, but rather in the exteriority of living labor. So it's kind of like an alternative to thinking about the sources of normativity, if you will, that I think doesn't get caught up in and bound to this kind of progressive teleological historicism that, as I see it, Habermas is still stuck with. And I mean, interestingly, I think Habermas, like, it all goes back actually to Habermas's reading of Marx, which is hugely foundational for his development of this aspect of his thinking. Anyway, Althusser is a little, I will be honest, it's a little less fully fleshed out in my own mind, so it might not have come through as clearly in the paper. But I mean, the basic idea is, I think that Althusser sort of forces a choice between the humanist Marx and the scientific Marx, the early and late projects, because he argues that there's a fundamental break between the two. And I think what Dussel does is to present again a kind of coherent vision of Marx as an ethical thinker from beginning to end. And there I would say, I actually just think that's a better interpretation of Marx. I feel like, if you read Capital Volume 1, it's just dripping with very ethically loaded language and descriptions. And I don't see how the kind of like Marx is not a norm. This is not a normative critique of capitalism, or Marx is not critiquing capitalism as an injustice or something. Like, I just don't see how that's sustained by the reading of the text. So I would say, even with respect to Althusser, that like this idea of the epistemological break and the anti-humanist Marx and all that stuff is like fascinating. And, it's an alternative way of trying to break out of these historical teleologies. But I think ultimately, less convincing as a reading of Marx, whatever its own other merits might be.
Yeah. Let me just make a comment. Valeria, the text you're referring to is Las Metáforas Teológicas de Marx, the theological metaphors of Marx. And actually, that text was written along the same period when Dussel is writing these commentaries. And parts of it have been translated and appear in something I edited, I don't know, like 20 years ago. So Amy knows, but they don't contradict anything that Amy has claimed. In fact, it adds more that to Amy's claim about the role of Schelling and later Levinas.
Yeah, that was kind of where my question was going, because this new reading that Dussel is presenting from Marx, I thought maybe had something to do with the fact that that Dussel was very interested earlier in Marx's theological metaphors. So I don't know if it has something to do with it, that Dussel is very interested in how the how would you say, the alteridad, the other the other, I don't know how you say that in English, but how you say that concept.
Alterity maybe is what you're thinking of. Yeah, in kind of radical transcendence or something, in a theological sense. Yeah. I defer to Eduardo, because he's really has much more, and others in the room probably have more expertise than I do on the development of Dussel's work as a whole. What I think is kind of interesting is, even if that's where it comes from, like that's where the interest comes from, if you read forward to like the Ethics of Liberation, the direction that Dussel takes these ideas is in the direction of thinking about like what is the standpoint of ethics and critique, and then the development of these ethical principles and the the project of a critical ethics and so on. So I guess that's probably the direction I'm approaching it more from, is from that later work backward rather than from the theological roots forward.
Exactly, as Professor Mendieta was saying, it does not contradict what you were saying, but if anything, it adds more. Thank you.
Deepen it. Yeah, no, absolutely. Thank you.
Good. Professor Allen, thanks so much for your presentation. We come to the end of this session. And for the second time, do you want to add something else, or we can close the session as you want?
No, I think I don't have anything to add at this point, but thank you so much for the discussion, which I really appreciated. It's very, very rich and very productive for me. So I appreciate it. And again, thank you for including me in this tribute series. It's a great honor and pleasure.
And thank you that you accepted the invitation. It was an honor to have you here. And I hope this is not the last time. I appreciate all the questions, all the comments by our guest here in the Zoom session. And we see you next time in the session or in the Carlos Pereda session with the paper Comprensión y Crítica, una discusión con Enrique Dussel, Comprehension and Critique, a discussion with Enrique Dussel. So thank you so much, dear Professor Allen, and we see you next time, next Monday. So see you. Ciao.
Thank you.